Good evening. This is Bob Coy again with Insights from the Bible. Tonight we're looking at the 42nd chapter of Isaiah. Now, chapter 42 kind of continues the theme of 40 and 41, and so we're looking at it from that perspective. Now, remember that these prophecies are addressed to a captive Judah in Babylon. And remember that this captivity comes long after Isaiah's death, maybe 150 years later from the time the prophecy was given, which was toward the end of Isaiah's life. And so Isaiah is prophesying to something that is yet well in the future. In chapter 42, Isaiah's vision. Now, 41, he talked about God raising a man from the east with Cyrus, we've talked about. Now he expands his vision, or God expands his vision, from God's earthly servant Cyrus to his promised servant Messiah. Now that's important. We're getting into some real messianic prophecies here. And doing so, when he prophesied his Messiah, he expands his vision from his people, the Jews, to the whole world. Jesus came to save the world, not just the Jews. So it's a glorious vision that we can all rejoice in. This chapter can be divided basically into two parts. The first 9 verses describe this Messiah that God is promising. The second, verses 10 through the end of the chapter 25, are a call to the whole world to rejoice. Remember, in the last chapter, it was called to the whole world, condemning them for their worship of idols. Now he's calling for the whole world to rejoice in the fact that he's sending a Savior to the whole world. Now, something else about this chapter, the first part of it particularly, it's the beginning of Isaiah's servant songs. Now, I've heard that phrase used, and I never really understand it, but there are 4 servant songs in Isaiah. In chapter 49, 50, and then 52 and 53, where we're familiar with the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. But this is the first of the servant songs. I want to be sure as we go along we cover those chapters with servant songs, because this is talking about God's servant. So we'll be looking at those. These describe the Messiah's responsibility to establish justice and lighten those in darkness. Notice how many times we see it's a light. Jesus is described as a light, and restore Israel's national salvation, and to bring salvation to all peoples. So the servant song, it comes in the first part. Actually, I think it's the first 4 verses in particular. But that's an important part of the last part of Isaiah. Let's begin looking at Isaiah by reading the first verse. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. Behold my servant. The word behold, now back up with me just a second. I want to look at behold in the last part of the last chapter. In verse 24 of the last chapter, behold, you're of no account. He says that to the Gentiles. In other words, he's calling their attention to the fact they're good for nothing. And then verse 29, behold, all of your idols are false. So twice he calls their attention. Behold, it's a command to pay attention. Behold, your idols are false. Now he says, behold my servant. It's a whole different tone of voice. It's a whole different tone. It's a positive, it's a wonderful tone. Behold my servant. The second thing I notice as I read the first verse is the final word, and look at it again. He will bring forth justice where? To the nations. Now, we've talked about before, whenever we find the word nations, it's those nations outside of Israel. So he's talking about he will bring justice to the world, to you and me. The word nation refers just like coastlands to the rest of the world. My servant, he says, behold my servant. Now, throughout the centuries, there's been a lot of discussion who this servant in Isaiah 42 is. Some people means the Jewish people are his servant, and certainly in the last chapter we found he addressed them as his servant. Some say it's Cyrus. Some say it's the Messiah. And certainly as we read these first 9 verses and read them quoted in the New Testament, it can be nobody else except the Messiah. And we'll look at that in the coming verses. Verse 2. I like this one. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. This speaks about the humility of the servant, the Messiah. In other words, he's not a braggadocio, he's not showy, he's humble. He will not cry out or raise his voice or make his voice heard in the street. Jennings, in one of our commentaries, state that the followers of this Messiah should be recognized by our humility as well. He mentions the fact that those followers who want to be on stage, who want to be the center of attention, wants to have preeminence, they give their fellow believers a lot of trouble. Think about it. In our world today, leaders who are showy, take charge, look at me type of leaders, they put a lot of us in a bad light. If we're really followers of Jesus the Messiah, we should have the same humility that he had. Verse 3, a bruised reed will he not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. It talks about his gentleness toward men. The bruised reed speaks of the penitent sinner who comes to him broken, repentant. He's not going to cut him off. He's going to forgive him. He's going to heal him. Does he finish him? Their faith might be as dim as a glimmering wick of a candle. He doesn't blow it out. He doesn't extinguish it. Far from it. He heals the bruise. He sparks the flame. He deals with the reeds and glimmering wicks, bringing us closer to himself, helping us to love and serve him better. He's gentle. I think too many times we lose sight of that. We see him as God the Father, the ruler of the universe, and we see ourselves for what we really are, unworthy sinners. And we need to realize that he loves us. In verse 4, he will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands, there's that word again, will wait expectantly for his law. The whole world will wait for his law. Finally, we see his attitude towards his mission. He's not going to give up. He's not going to get discouraged. He's not going to change his purpose. Not only will he not break or bruise or extinguish others, but the pressures of this world and the enemy won't extinguish him. This reflects the power of God's Spirit in his life. Notice the word coastlands that I mentioned as we read it in the last part of the verse. Here it reflects the need or the desire of my world, the Gentile world, to find his gospel or law, the doctrine of faith. Let's look now at verses 5 through 8. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who will walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open blind eyes and bring out prisoners from the dungeon, and those who dwell in darkness from prison. Now look at this. I am the Lord. That is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. I am the Lord. That is my name. 3 times in these 4 verses, 5 through 8, we see the word Lord. Now, whenever we see the word Lord spelled with all capital letters, the Hebrew word behind it, or the Hebrew word translated Lord with all capitals, is Jehovah or Jehovah. Or in the Hebrew language, it's just YHWH, Yahweh. The meaning of the word is the existing one. Remember when Moses was at the burning bush and he asked God what his name? He said, "You're sending me to your people. Who shall I say has sent me?" And God said, now listen to this, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Now, 7 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus used the phrase I am. One of them, I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the water of life. 7 times. One time he said, before Abraham was, I am. God says, my name is I am. I am the Lord. That is my name. I am. Now we need to remember that. As I've read this and studied this and think about it, I am. Hallowed be thy name. I am. Whatever we need, whenever we need it. Not I was or I will be. I am eternal. What a powerful statement. I am the Lord. I will not share my glory with another. In verse 5, Jehovah tells us of his creative power. I created the heavens, stretched them out. He did all that. His power, after describing him in verse 2 and 4, he now speaks directly. Notice in verse 6, he says, as a light to the nations. How many times in the New Testament we see the word light, especially in the Gospel of John. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness doesn't get it, comprehends it not. I think particularly in Luke 2:29, Simeon, the old gentleman in the temple whom Mary and Joseph brought in Jesus as a babe to be dedicated, Simeon took him up and he said, Lord, now let your servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people. A light to lighten the Gentiles. The very first part of Luke, when they brought him for dedication, Simeon says that I'm convinced under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. A light to lighten the Gentiles. I like verse 8. Here, Jehovah turns from addressing his servant, the Messiah, to addressing the people. I am the Lord, that's my name. I will not give my glory to another. He emphatically states his name and says, I will not give my glory to another or my praise to graven images. That means so much to me today. My mind goes to another phrase that we talked about early in another session. Hallowed be thy name, or holy be thy name. And thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. There's a message here for our generation. How easy it is today for men to put their trust and their praise into technology and man's creations. But guys, folks, let's keep our focus on the great I Am, the creator and the sustainer of everything, even the technology that men have come to worship. 42:9, the last verse of this section. This is a good one too. Behold, the former things have come to pass. Now I declare new things. Before they spring forth, I proclaim them to you. In other words, all the prophecies I've given to you in the past have come to pass. Now I'm giving you a new one. What's he talking? The one he's just given us about his servant, the Messiah, is a new thing that he's declaring. Now I'm giving you a new thing, and it will come to pass, because everything I've told you before has come to pass. Now I'm giving you a new thing. Before they spring, I proclaim them to you, a new thing. The section ends like it began, behold. Behold in verse 1, behold in verse 9. God states what he prophesied in the past would happen. They have happened. Now he's telling us this Messiah. Verses 10 through 12. I like this too. Remember, he said, behold, I'm now giving you a new thing. And then he says in verse 10, sing to the Lord a new song. A new thing, a new song. Sing his praise from the end of the earth, you who go down to the sea and all that's in it, you islands and those who dwell on them. Let the wilderness and its cities lift up your voices, the settlements where Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing aloud. Let them shout for joy from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise in the coastlands. This is a message to the world. Verse 10 begins this new section. Now, he's not talking to the Messiah or to the Jews. He's talking to the world here, telling them to rejoice in the Messiah. A new song. Now, whenever they talked about a new song in in the Old Testament, in Bible times, they were referring to something new producing a new song, a new event that generated the new song. It wasn't just somebody wrote new words to something that already happened. They're talking about something new. So God says, a new thing I'm proclaiming, and then he says, sing a new song for this new thing. Don't you like that? Now he says this to be sung to the nations. Notice he mentions the islands and the wilderness, and then he mentions two places by name, the settlements where Kedar inhabits. What was Kedar? Who was Kedar? Kedar was a son of Ishmael. You can find that, look it up in the Bible. So Kedar was a son of Ishmael. He settled somewhere in Arabia. So when he talks about the inhabitants of Kedar, he's talking about some remote village. On the other hand, he speaks of Selah. Selah means fortress or rock. And it usually is related to a town near Petra. Remember where Petra is? Petra is this hidden rock village where many believe the Jews will go during the tribulation. So he's saying in Kedar and Selah, saying, let them shout from the tops of the mountains and in the coastland, all the world, let them sing for joy because a new thing has happened. What new thing? The Messiah has come. Wow. This is prophecy at its best. So this song looks beyond the release from captivity of those Jews in Babylon. And it looks for release from captivity for you and me in this world of sin. There is release to the captive today in the name of the Messiah. Verse 13, the Lord will go forth like a warrior. He will arouse his zeal like a man of war. He will utter a shout. Yes, he will raise a war cry. He will prevail against his enemies. This verse gives reason for the praise just called for. It's glorified in the fact that one day God would raise a mighty warrior to overcome his enemies. Now, he did this with Cyrus, to be sure. He allowed the Israelites to return to their land, but he did it in a mightier way when he brought the Messiah to accomplish our redemption. He'll do it in an even greater way when the same Messiah returns to come back to earth to defeat his enemies at Armageddon and beyond. The best is yet to come. This is not what we term gospel today. For Jehovah's coming with a war shout. And when we hear gospel, we think, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. No, here it's not a personal thing. Here Jehovah, God, I am, is intervening in the politics of this world. Did you get that? Intervening in the politics of this world. Don't we need that today? For him to intervene in the politics. He will. It's coming. This is the new thing that's told about here. But it's coming. Revelations 11, verse 15, kind of sum it all up. When the angel said, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. It's coming. That's good news. That's the gospel. 42, verse 14. This now talks about the blindness of God's people. That's the caption in my Bible. Now listen to this. It kind of goes with what we talked about earlier when it said he will not brag, he's humble. I have kept silent for a long time. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now, like a woman in labor, I will groan, I will both gasp and pant. That's a difficult verse, isn't it? I have kept silent for a long time. The text changes from the third person to he will to now it's I will. I have kept silent for a long time. Now, when I read this verse, I can't help but think about being reminded Isaiah 53, the suffering servant psalm. It says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, but he opened not his mouth. He is led as a lamb to the slaughter, but as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Here, Christ is saying of himself, I have kept silent for a long time. I've kept still and restrained myself. I also noticed when I read in the New Testament about the trial of Christ before his crucifixion, at least a couple of times they quizzed him and he kept silent. Pilate quizzed him. Caiaphas quizzed him and he didn't answer. He kept silent. And then we come to this last section about a pregnant woman. And I ask myself, what is he talking about here? Puzzling at first. God himself explained he'd remain quiet a long time, but in the future he would cry out as a pregnant woman before she gives birth. Now, this pain he's talking about is painful. But what happens as after the final cry, something beautiful happens, a new life is born, a new child comes into the world. So the cry out at the birth pangs is painful, but it brings forth something beautiful. And so God says he will cry out. That signals that God would bring forth a new thing. Again, my mind goes back to the cross. In the trials, he was silent. But in all three of the synoptic gospels, all three writers say before he died, before he breathed his last, he cried out with a loud voice. And to me, isn't it like a birth pang, because as he died, new life was born for all of us. We were redeemed. We were given a new life through his death and resurrection. So again, as I read, like a woman in birth pangs, I will cry out. There's something beautiful after that cry, and that's our ability to be born again. Wonderful prophecy. Okay, let's read 15 through 17. I will lay waste the mountains and the hills and wither all their vegetations. I will make the rivers into coastlands and dry up the ponds. I will lead the blind by a way they don't know. In paths they do not know, I will guide them. I will make darkness into light before them, and the rugged places into plain. These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone. They will be turned back and will be utterly put to shame who trust in idols, who say to the molten images, you are our God. As I read through those passages, from here to verse 18, how many times do you see the word I will appear? First, twice in verse 15, talking about I will punish the enemies. And then 4 times in verse 15, talking about his redemption of the lost. Now, the important thing here to remember is that when Yahweh, I am, says I will, he doesn't mean I'll try, or I'll think about it, or if this happens, I will. He means I will. If I am says I will, it will happen. No question about it. Is it any wonder that he admonishes us to put our trust in him? Wow. Then he talks about the blind man. Now, if you put a blind man in a place like his home, where he's familiar with, he'll feel something and he'll find his way around with confidence. But you put him in a place he's never been, and he's lost. So these poor Israelites, and including us even now, can find all the past no precedent that will direct us in the future, because it's unknown. But Yahweh, I am, Jesus takes their hand in ours, and as they abandon themselves to his guidance, not one step goes astray. Trust him, follow him, be guided by him. All who trust in anything else are put to shame. They'll fall, they'll stumble. This is good for any generation, any dispensation. Put your trust in him. Now, verse 17 again talks about those who trust in idols. I think we need to realize that when he talks about trusting in idols, he's not talking about the little images that we set in our living rooms and burn incense to and pray to. People don't do that anymore. At least I don't. I don't think you do. But it's so easy to put our trust in man's inventions, ingenuities, and abilities. I've come to this conclusion. Anything that turns my trust away from the great I am is an idol. Think about that. Anything that turns my trust away from him is an idol. Put your trust in him. Okay, let's go back to 18 through 20. Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant? Or so deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as he that is at peace with me, or so blind as the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but you don't observe them. Your ears are open, but none hears. Here again, we have this phrase that happens so often: hearing, but not hearing, seeing, but not seeing. We go through the motions. Those who are deaf but don't see. So Jehovah, Yahweh, identifies the blind as his servant and messenger. It's the servant of the Lord of all the people. He's talking to Israel. You see, but you don't see. You just don't get it. You've got all the word, you've got all the Torah, the teachings, but you're not getting it. This is especially true of the leaders. Now, Jesus said that when he was on earth. They're blind but don't see. Remember when he said he told his disciples that he taught in parables that they might understand, but the people did not understand. When Jesus was on earth, they did not understand that he was the Messiah. He was the promised one. Macher adds a comment, brings it right down to our day. Let me read it for you. What can be done for a needy world when the people of God are themselves just as needy and appear to have but lost a clue of the saving remedies? Could this be true in the church? We've lost. We hear, but we don't understand. We see, but we don't really grasp what we're seeing. It scares me. We need to wake up. 21 and 22. The Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to make the law great and glorious. But this is a people plundered and despoiled. All of them are trapped in caves or hidden away in prisons. They have become a prey with none to deliver them, and a spoil with none to say, give them back. I believe verse 21 is talking about the consequences of Israel's faithlessness. Do you realize that just in the last 60, 75 years, it appears that Israel's waking up, realizing how blind they've been? As Janet and I have watched testimonies of Jewish people who have turned to the Messiah, how many times has it been chapter 53 of this book, Isaiah, that has turned their eyes? I read just a couple of days ago where Israel believed that Isaiah 53 spoke of the Messiah until the Middle Ages, when the church persecuted the Jews. And they said it was talking about the Jews. But they're waking up. They're beginning to understand. They're turning back to the Messiah. I think it's a beautiful age in which we live. But in the meantime, they have been persecuted throughout history, with the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, today by much of the world, anti-Semitism. I think that's what this is talking about. 21 indicates, I think, that what they have gone through is not God's plan or his will. He was to make his teaching great and glorious through his people. But because of their blindness, they were in captivity and miserable, and perhaps throughout the ages. Again, I think we can see this was not God's plan or his pleasure, but necessary justice. I think that's what he's talking about in those verses. In verse 23, who among you will give ear to this? Who will give heed and listen hereafter? In other words, who will wake up and really hear what I'm saying? The prophet despaired, and nobody was listening. He was saying, who will listen? Somebody needs to listen. And then the last two verses. Who gave Jacob up for spoil and Israel to plunders? Wasn't it not the Lord, against whom we have sinned? Again, this is Isaiah speaking. And in whose ways they're not willing to walk, and whose law they didn't obey. So he poured out on him the heat of his anger and the fierceness of battle, and it set him aflame all around, yet he didn't recognize it, and it burned him, and he paid no attention. What a tragic ending. God's people needed to realize that their sin had led them to the present condition. It was not God's will and pleasure. He had better things planned, but they're sinned. So they chose their own way, and the judgment of God has burned them. Oh, I pray that doesn't happen to God's people in the world today, but it's scary. Let's trust in him. Let's open our ears and eyes to the Word of God and put our trust in him and walk in the way that he guides us. Thank you for watching again tonight. It's been good talking about Isaiah 42. It's meant a lot to me. It's taught me a lot. And I hope maybe you've picked up a few things that are helpful to you as well. So again, I thank you for being with us this evening.